Welcome back, AP. All right, so welcome back. Fantastic day in class yesterday. We reviewed so much of Russia. We talked about Peter the Great's growth as a true absolutist of Russia. We talked about the founding of St. Petersburg. We talked about the westernization of Russia. We talked about Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Grozny, right? Actually becoming like the first czar of Russia, leading into this big thing. Well, now we're moving into England, right? So go ahead and make sure in your notes we're moving into England and their attempts at absolutism. Yeah, that's right. I said it. Attempts at absolutism. Because let's take a look at y'all's magnificent project. All right, look at that bad boy. It is ridiculous. They're posting it on the social media for the school. I don't even know how I'm going to handle it, right? I'm going to keep this up forever. And as y'all said, when I retire one day, I'll just decorate my home with it. Now, look, check this out. Big thing about this map of absolutism you see behind me is all the red yarns are connecting true absolutist states to their countries. And also you can see that I've got a lot of eyebrows going on right now. Now, big thing about it, though, is that these red yarns, right, we see the Bourbons going to Versailles, and we see the Valois going to Paris because that's where they had their absolutist state or pseudo-absolutist state. We have the Ruhr kids going to Moscow, the Romanovs going to St. Petersburg. We have the Hohenzollerns going to Prussia, which we will talk about later. Then we have the Habsburgs going to Austria and Vienna. Now, wait a second. What's this? All right, so this yarn is green. This is not red. What is this shenanigans? Well, so there never was a true absolutist in England, right? England is not going to have an absolute monarchy. They're actually going to be stuck with what's known as a constitutional monarchy, right? They are a constitutional system, mainly due to one singular document, the Magna Carta. Yay! For the rest of your lives, you should say yay every time you hear the phrase Magna Carta, just because it literally sets up your basic rights. It's a very important document. So do me a favor, clear your pipes out a little bit. I'm going to say it, and you're just going to say yay behind your computer, just to make sure that you know and understand that this document is very important, and it limited the power of the kings of England and established the British Parliament, right? So, and the British Parliament, just so you know, is the legislative branch of England. Let's go ahead and jot that down as well. The British Parliament is the legislative branch of England. It is divided into two houses, right? It's the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The power truly residing within the House of Commons, which is where the location of the British Prime Minister is today. All right, so now look, going into it though, the Magna Carta, beautiful. I heard you over there, Malaya. Now anyway, so the big thing about it though is the Magna Carta, thank you, Angelina, is going to be the thing that establishes the British Parliament, and it is going to create what's known as a limited monarchy, right? A limited monarchy. It prevents an English king from ever truly becoming what you would refer to as an absolutist. So, spoiler alert, they're never actually going to have an absolutist, but they are going to have some guys that try to be absolutists, right? So let's go ahead and really quick do a preview of this, okay? So you have to understand that the death of the Tudors is coming. Why? Why are the Tudors going to die? Well, the Tudors are going to die because Elizabeth never has any children. All right, so why does Elizabeth never have any children? Elizabeth never has any children because she is proclaimed the Virgin Queen, right? The state of Virginia is named for her because she was the Virgin Queen that apparently never felt the touch of a man, right? So, is what she says. So, big thing about it, she is going to die. I know all of you are heartbroken all across the world right now. In 1603, Emma Dewey, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine, Emma. We're going to keep going, though. We're going to keep going in her memory, all right? So, Emma Dewey, focusing on this tragic event in English history is really important because in 1603, when she dies, there's no one to take the throne of England, right? So who is going to rise up but James, right? And check this out. Don't write James yet. Don't write James yet. Who is going to rise up? The House of Stuart, right? So the House of Stuart. So the Stuart monarchs are now coming into power because they are the most directly related by blood to the Tudors, right? So let's just go ahead and turn this way real fast. So just so you understand, let's go ahead and outline the Stuart monarchy in total so you know where we're going before we get there. For those of you who are like, I like to go forward and write down everything and then listen to what you say. Well, this is important. That's why I'm stopping it early, okay? So check this out. So we have the Stuart monarchy, right? So the Stuart monarchy, right? So the big thing about the Stuart monarchy is when you're looking at it, we're going to give it a code, right? We're going to give it a code. I'm not going to write down every single name, stuff like that. We're just going to give it a little bit of a code, all right? So here's how it goes, okay? It goes James the First, right? J1, okay? And then it goes Charles the First, C1, okay? And then it goes, oh, that's terrible, black market. Get that out of here. All right, so then it goes Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth. All right, so Commonwealth. Okay, we're going to go ahead and write Commonwealth. So this is a period where a guy named Oliver Cromwell is going to take over for a little while, and they actually get rid of the Stuart monarchs for a hot minute. All right, so, and then we're going to go back to the Stuarts again with Charles II and then James II, okay? So if you want to look at it this way, it's kind of like a mirrored image of itself, right? It goes James I, Charles I, Commonwealth, Charles II, James II, right? So you have to understand that this is the line of Stuart monarchs in the main bulk of the story. Now, at the very, very end, James II is going to, spoiler alert, be ran off by his daughter, and we will talk about her later on, another very famous and very powerful female individual from European history, right? But that's just kind of an outline of how the Stuart monarchs are going to go, right? So who do we have to talk about first? Got to talk about James first, right? So, and I love the story of English history, and I love the English Civil War, which surprisingly enough is a subject that not even many English people themselves know a ton about, right? But let's talk about James, right? Also, we're missing a number for James, right? So James the First is also James the Sixth. Wait a minute. James the First is going to be the first James of England, but James the Sixth is also this guy, right? So he is James the First and the Sixth, right? And he's going to rule from 1603 to 1625. And some of you are like, Mr. Terry, back up. How can this guy have two numbers? Salvaggio, Grace, Kimberly. Give me a second. I'll explain it. All right, so now, look, the big thing is because James was proclaimed king of Scotland before he was ever proclaimed king of England. Wait a minute. Who is this guy? All right, so, oh yeah. He is one of the Scots, right? He is actually related, and we'll talk about that in a hot second, to our girl, Mary, Queen of Scots, right? So, big thing about it, though, is you're going to now see power pass from the Tudors to the Stuarts, who were the rulers of Scotland, right? So he's James I of England and James VI of Scotland, right? And so from 1603 to 1625, you're going to see this process happen called the Union of the Crowns, right? So when we're looking back at your amazing AP project, actually when we look at it, England, Ireland, and Scotland are all one color, and this is post-Stuart monarchy, right? Because this would have been a different color up here in Scotland. Now it's one color because of the Union of the Crowns, right? Write that down, the Union of the Crowns, right? The Union of the Crowns is going to become James I and James VI. His son would then become the very first king of the United Kingdom itself. They didn't call it the United Kingdom yet, but it's coming, okay? So the Union of the Crowns happens under James, right? So, but let's talk about his personality a little bit, right? So James I is a married man, and he has two kids, right? He's got two sons that are surviving. Two sons are Henry and Charles, right? Henry, strapping young man, very beautiful young man apparently. Apparently, like, was a big time charmer, very charming, showed signs of being able to be a great leader one day, right? So, like, everybody's very excited about Henry on the way. He would have eventually been Henry the Ninth. All right, so he would have been Henry the Ninth. And then James the First is going to, like, literally have another son, Charles, right? Charles, on the other hand, is kind of sickly. He has a lot of bouts of illness when he's a young child. He's very short. He's like kind of a pasty kid, like needs to get out in the sunlight a little bit more. But big things about James's personality is he's very eccentric. He's very over the top. And he actually leaves Scotland when he's becoming the King of England and goes to London and literally never turns back and leaves both of his sons behind and his wife. Leaves them back in Scotland, right? Speaking of James's personality, he's very eccentric, he's very over the top, and another big thing about it, you need to jot this down, you're going to see it again, but it's very important early on that you understand that James is jealous of everybody else in Europe, right? James can see what is on the horizon in Europe, right? He witnesses what's going on in Russia. Well, this is actually going to be during like their time of troubles, which is really rough. But he can see what's occurring in Russia, and he sees these absolute monarchs rising and falling, right? He sees the Hohenzollerns consolidating their power in Prussia. He sees the Habsburgs consolidating their power. He sees in France the monarchs are consolidating their power as well, and they're turning towards absolutism. And he believes in this concept called the divine right of kings, right? He believes that God chose him to be king. Just an important thing to note. And who is this guy? Well, speaking of his personality, that right there is the Duke of Buckingham, also known as George Villiers, right? So George Villiers is apparently excuse me, is apparently James's favorite. Right now, a favorite is your best courtier, right? It's your best courtly advisor, right? It's your best courtier, and he was everywhere with him. He had a nickname for him, which was Steenie. Called him Steenie all the time because apparently he said George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham was his title, was just so handsome, and apparently St. Stephen was so handsome, right? And so James called him Steenie all the time. So there's some things about James's relationship with this guy that we're not positive about. It's a heavily debated thing. But it's kind of important to note, right? Because he has these favorites he's choosing. He has these intertwined relationships with the nobility class that he's choosing and ranking them above and below one another, right? And also he probably more than likely had a relationship with this person. And this guy is going to actually pop up repeatedly, all right? But it is also a heavy part about James's personality. James is also a very intense figure, right? Very, very intense figure, very over the top, like I said. Apparently when he was crowned king, and alert, if there are parents or guardians or anyone listening to this, I am directly quoting this guy. And I'm not necessarily saying a curse word. I'm saying a word that they use to define someone's butt in like England and Scotland. All right. So now apparently James was so over the top that when he was being crowned king of England, not like they were lowering the crown onto his head, but when he was arriving in London to go to his coronation ceremony and to actually be a part of this entire coronation process, he literally, by one of his other courtiers, was like, "Sir, show your face, wave to the people, they want to see you." And James replied to this man as, "I'd rather show them me arse." And then he tried to moon them out of the carriage window, right? Tried to lift his kilt up and actually moon them, which is hilarious to me. So he said, "God's wounds, I'd rather show them me arse." Now, hilarious, right? So big things, though, also about his personality. The people of England were very aware of this relationship, very aware that he was kind of a crude guy, very aware that he thought he was awesome, very aware of who he was. And so apparently they didn't like him out the gate, right? The people of England were not a fan of him because they had massive issues with religion. And so the people of England start talking junk about him, right? They start talking mad work about him. And they actually was a very famous phrase in England under the reign of James, which was, "When we had Elizabeth, we had our king, and now we have our queen in James," right? So, which is very mean. And I know Morgan's like, "Oh my God." I know, right? It's a very intense insult. Also, he just did not have good rapport with the English people whatsoever. He tried to outlaw tobacco one time because he thought the smoke was offensive. And he issued a poem, an edict, actually without his name signed on it, that said, the taking in of tobacco is a disgusting habit and it should be taken away. And people laughed at it and crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. He then was like, "Oh, they would listen if it had my name on it." He reissued that document with his name attached to it, and people still laughed and crumpled it up and threw it away. And some historians argue that more people started smoking in spite of him, right? So a lot of this hatred, a lot of this "he's our queen," a lot of this the show me butt thing and everything else, a lot of it stems from one key issue that James struggled with from an early out the gate moment. He had to deal with the religious divisions of England, right? So there's going to be massive religious divides, okay? Now, when you look at England, you've got a lot of major problems when it comes to faith, right? Because the Anglican faith is pretty much the pseudo-faith of the state. You've got some secret Catholics running around still. You have Puritans now, which are Calvinists who want to purify and purge all Catholic elements out of the Anglican Church, and then it'll be what they want it to be, which is a purer form of it, right? And then amongst the Puritans, you also have these people known as Separatists, right? And Separatists or Puritan Separatists, so you've got Puritans and then Puritan Separatists, are ones that are like, "Oh, we just don't even want to be here anymore," right? So look, when you got the Puritans, you have to understand that James hates Puritans, right? He can't stand them. He thinks Puritans are awful. He thinks they're annoying because they want social revolution. They want to outlaw drinking. They want to outlaw anything that's not like singing, big events, big celebrations, anything that distracts from service in God, right? So, and that's a big Calvinist element that they learned from Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. Bloody Mary runs them away. They learn it, come back, they're jerks. All right, so now look, Puritans, though, they want a social revolution, and they want to cleanse the Anglican Church of its Catholic elements, right? Then the Puritan Separatists just want to straight up leave, and this is going to be a big key thing that comes up later, okay? So, and he would struggle with this in a lot of different ways, and one of the biggest gripes that Puritans had with the Anglican Church, and this is what I'm explaining now if you want to write a little extra note underneath it, one of the biggest gripes that Puritans had with the Anglican Church was they didn't like how the Anglican Church still retained some of the hierarchical values of the Catholic faith, right? They didn't like how there was actually still like bishops and clergymen and cardinals and like there was not cardinals, but there were bishops that were inside of the Anglican Church that established a hierarchy of priests, and Puritans were like, that's disgusting. That's just getting in the way of our worship to God, having to go through this other person. And so what the Puritans suggested, and here's the thing, some of you are like, why is he even listening to the Puritans? I thought they were just a nuisance. Puritans are starting to be elected to Parliament. Yeah, that's a big thing that I forgot to mention, all right? Some Puritans are starting to be elected into Parliament, all right? So now that you've got Puritan government officials, they suggest let's get rid of the bishop altogether and go to these things called presbyters, right? And presbyters are like not Presbyterians, but presbyters would be councils of lay people that would help guide the church in the right direction. Some of you are like, this sounds a lot like the conciliar movement. It is a lot like the conciliar movement, inspired by the conciliar movement from over 100 years before it. And they were like, this makes more sense. We don't want people in charge of the religion or in charge of the thing itself. And so basically, James responded to that with a very famous phrase. He said, no bishop, no king, right? And the reason why he meant that is like, if you get rid of the bishop, you might as well get rid of the king because you're getting rid of central figures, right? You're getting rid of central monarchical figures, people that rule individual like things or organizations from them, right? So he's like, if we have no bishop, we might as well have no king. So he kept the bishops and ignored the Puritans, right? That's really messed up. Also, another thing about it was there are, there are Presbyterians in Scotland as well, right? So that's another big thing he has to deal with. How are you going to try and unify these two areas, these crowns, if you've got Presbyterians up north and you've got Anglicans down south, right? So James, though, also the biggest one he has to deal with is the Catholics, right? Because he is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, right? And was surprisingly tolerant of Catholics. Some of you are like, wait a second, back up. How is he not Catholic himself and furious at the English crown, and especially at Elizabeth, for having his mother executed in a hilarious fashion? A lot of it has to do with the fact that when she was executed, James was only like 1.5, right? So he barely even knew her. And he also was an Anglican himself. So he kind of in the back of his mind was like, oh, she might have deserved it, which is really screwed up. Now, but the big thing about it, though, he was surprisingly tolerant of Catholics early on. He said, look, if they're not in my face and they're not annoying anybody, then I'm not really concerned about them. But then he pulls a 180 out of nowhere, and he bans their public worship and turns mean and forces them to go to Anglican Mass in a process called rescendancy, right? He's like, you're not actually going to Anglican Mass, which means you're not actually adhering to the king, you're not adhering to the bishop, you're not going with my stuff, divine right, I'm mad, blah, 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 blah. So, he starts infuriating a lot of the Catholics, right? And he actually infuriates them so much that at one point, this guy, on November the 5th, tries to blow him up. All right, so now look, jot this down. 11/5. The Gunpowder Plot, right? So apparently he made the Catholics so furious when he said, you have to go to Anglican Mass, you are not allowed to worship in public. Yes, you can be Catholic, but do not bother us with it. Catholics were like, how dare you? How dare you do this to us? We've been fighting for our lives this entire time. So a Catholic plot is conspired. 16 Catholic guys get together, led by Robert Catesby, and this guy, Guy Fawkes, right? Guy Fawkes spelled Fauks, okay? And they conspire to blow up Parliament when James goes to address it. Because the king had to go address Parliament every time that there was, Parliament was started or enacted. And so he decides that he wants to blow them up, right? So what they do is they are planning to put barrels of gunpowder under Parliament. And when he gets there, they want to blow it up from underneath. But what happens is this guy, Guy Fawkes, gets caught down there because his buddies turn on him, right? So Robert and the other conspirators turn on them and turn on him and leave him down there by himself. He gets caught. He then gets tortured, turns them in, and all of them get executed, right? And so there's a poem, a very famous poem that actually goes along with this event, and it goes, Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I should think of no reason why the gunpowder treason shall ever be forgot. And the reason why it's such a big thing is it became an anti-Catholic holiday in England, right? Even to this day, they celebrate Gunpowder Day in England, and they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, like big straw stuffed Guy Fawkes, right? So but it's a big deal. So he's dealing with a lot of religious issues, right? So, and also, big thing you need to understand is that James absolutely hates Parliament, right? Why does he hate Parliament? It's because he believes that him and his sons should have the divine right to rule, right? He does not want to address Parliament for anything. Right? He doesn't want to go to them. He does not want to talk to them. He wants to have as much money as he can get his hands on, and he wants to do whatever he wants to do, right? And he also angers Parliament repeatedly, because a big thing about it is he has no money, all right? So, you have to understand, James he believes he's a divine right king, right? And he comes before Louis XIV, which is even crazier, right? So you could theoretically say that James might have set the tone for absolute monarchs throughout most of Europe. Well, actually, the trend was growing anyway. So the big thing about it, James believed he was that divine right ruler. This literally is how much of a divine right ruler he believed he was. This painting is by Peter Paul Rubens, and it's inside of Whitehall. And Whitehall is the palace that came before Buckingham Palace, and is actually the place where kings lived, right? It was where kings lived at the time. And he had the entire thing renovated on the inside, right? And he paid for all this with money that he thought he had, but he actually didn't have, and all this other stuff. And it was painted and made for him. This is a very big absolute monarchy pull, right? And Peter Paul Rubens was a Dutch artist that was brought in to paint the ceilings, right? And so this image right here shows King Solomon, right, the great king of Judaism, and blessing baby James. This is James as a fat, pudgy, naked baby, blessing him with his authority to rule, and images of Greek gods and goddesses, and also the female images of Great Britain and Scotland laying the crown on baby James's head. This is how arrogant this guy was. This is how intensely he thought that God chose him, right? While he's hanging out with the Duke of Buckingham, and he's also, trying to moon people and trying to outlaw tobacco for no reason, but he angers Parliament a lot, because Parliament's like, look, because of the Magna Carta, thank you. Because of that document, you have to work with us, and it says that you can't raise taxes without asking us first. So Parliament holds this power known as the power of the purse, right? They literally control tax money. And where does a king get all their money? From taxes, right? And so he wants to do some different things. He wants to up one tax that goes straight to the king, known as tonnage and poundage, right? So tonnage and poundage is a tax that the king was allowed to collect in a certain window of time, right? And in tonnage and poundage, tonnage is the weight of wine, right? So he wanted to tax wine that was coming in from Spain and France, right? That money would go straight to his pocket. And poundage is the weight of goods coming in on ships. And he wanted that money to go straight to his pocket, which traditionally it did. But the Parliament was like, you can't just use this as your piggy bank all the time, man. You have a window of time you can collect this, and then that's it, right? And so he gets so furious, he's like, and he starts trying to collect something he invented called ship money, where he goes up to cities, he's like, provide me with boats or the money to buy a boat, and then he would take that ship money and stick it in his pocket, right? Again, he's infuriating, absolutely infuriating his entire Parliament, right? Also, he wants to arrange the marriage of one of his sons early on to a Spanish Catholic girl, and then later on to a French Catholic girl, which is another big no-no as far as the Puritan Parliament is concerned, right? And then also, not to mention the fact that he executes Sir Walter Raleigh, right? So Sir Walter Raleigh, he actually originally put him in life prison, but then Sir Walter Raleigh did something again, and then he has Sir Walter Raleigh executed. So it's a very, very big issue. He also overturned the Parliament's try and get rid of George Valere and stuff. But anyway, the Duke of Buckingham, his buddy. So big thing about it, though, is he's going to have these massive feuds with Parliament. Look at James. He's not doing the Louis leg, but he is showing some leg. All right, so he's going to have massive feuds with Parliament, huge feuds with Parliament. And this is going to stall voting and choke monetary resources and stuff like that, because Parliament's like, look, you want to play this game? Yeah, we'll take your tonnage and poundage into consideration, but we need a break, right? We're going to go and we're going to vote on Tuesday. All right, we'll vote on Tuesday. And then Tuesday would come and they'd be like, oh, we forgot to vote on that. So we'll vote on that next week. And the next week would come and they'd be like, you don't feel like it. All right, so and they would stall voting to try and choke James's money from his pockets, right? Because actually someone did the finances of James's books, and he had no money. He was actually in debt, right? And this was trying to prevent James from controlling his own money. So what does James do to Parliament? He dissolves them. Now, in 1622, he dissolves Parliament, which means he fires them, right? So, theoretically speaking, he just got rid of the entire legislative branch of the British government established by the Magna Carta. Thank you. And the big thing about it, though, is that getting rid of this branch is very aggressive. Is it a power the king has? Yes. But is it something they traditionally do? No, because the Parliament represents the people, right? So he fires them in 1622, and he tries to rule and tries to collect taxes on his own for a short period of time, but actually just ends up basically living in debt, right? He tries to issue these things called forced loans, and he keeps borrowing money from other countries and stuff like that, and he ends up just putting himself into further debt, right? His only true successes, he had a few true successes, was he had the King James version of the Bible written to try and appease the Puritans, right? He tried to appease them, be like, all right, fine, here's a vernacular Bible, go write it, right? So the King James version of the Bible is the Bible that we now use, right? He also started the colony of Jamestown, right? He started the colony of Jamestown in Virginia, right? Named after him, okay? And he also gave the Virginia Company their charter, right? To go off and start this colony. And also, he chartered a settlement for the Puritan Separatists. He let them have Plymouth. And that, of course, is where your Puritan, Plymouth, Massachusetts folks come from, right? He is actually going to be the guy that starts the Plymouth colony in 1612, 1620, what year was that? 1622 or something like that? Plymouth colony. So what year? Plymouth Rock? No, not Plymouth Rock. That's a tourist attraction. Plymouth colony. Here we go. We'll start in 1620. Yeah. So in 1620 he charters that colony. So he did do a lot for colonizing America. He had the King James version of the Bible written, but he also set a disgusting tone. Right. That's a big result. Right. Big result of James is he sets a tone for his son on the way. And some of you are like, oh, Henry. Henry's the good one, right? Henry will fix all this stuff. It'll be fine. What I didn't tell you is that Henry died from tuberculosis at the age of 15. No, not actually tuberculosis, from typhoid fever. He died from a bad case of typhoid, and so who are you left with now? Oh, we're left with Charles, the really angry kid, the guy that's kind of mad at his dad in a weird way. He's like, what are you doing all the time? You left me in Scotland, blah, 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 blah. And here comes Charles, right? So Charles is going to rule from 1625 to 1649. And this is what Charles looks like, okay? Charles is, as we can tell, a kind of like a sickly looking dude in real life, right? So he had a lot of self-confidence issues, right? So Charles is got mad little man syndrome. And I actually mean that, right? Because he has what you would now refer to as a Napoleonic complex, which is actually a misnomer because he was average height, but not Charles, but Napoleon was average height. So Charles is actually shorter than Napoleon. I think he was around 5'2". So he was very short, malnourished as a child, had bouts of sicknesses, had a speech impediment as well. So he tried to train himself to speak better by putting rocks in his mouth when he was a kid and trying to talk with them in there. And he just ended up making his speech impediment slightly worse, and then also shattered one of his back teeth, right? So he then also would just run for days. He would just run all the time to try and stay in tip-top physical shape, which made him ridiculously skinny, right? So Charles is coming in with his dad setting this negative tone with Parliament, trying to act like a divine right ruler, and he's been living his whole life with his father telling him that you have the divine right of kings, right? And so when Charles comes in, Charles actually dissolves Parliament once as well. He's a huge jerk, but the big thing that occurs is that he is such a terrible ruler. All right, so James was bad. Charles was worse. So he's going to do a lot of negative stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain all this in class, right? So do me a favor, jot all this stuff down. We're going to stop right here, and we're going to pick up right here on this list that is going to kind of give us a little bit of indication of why Parliament is going to hate Charles so much, okay? So we'll talk about that stuff later on. I'll see you guys soon. And I'll, if I find a solid video, I'll include it down in the description, but I'll see what I can do, okay? But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.